You step out of the machine. The year is 1914. Somewhere nearby, a young man is loading a pistol. You know his name. You know what he's about to do, and you're here to stop him. This is the fantasy. Find the one moment. Change the one variable. Save millions of lives. But the real answer is far stranger. Even if you stop that bullet, the war probably still happens. Not eventually, almost immediately. Here's what you're not accounting for. By the summer of 1914, Europe wasn't a calm system waiting for one spark. It was a room full of gas, and there were a dozen open flames, not one. The assassination in Sarajevo gets all the credit because it's a story with a villain and a victim and a single tragic afternoon. Real history is messier. It doesn't hinge on one man's aim. Think about what you actually know about that day. A teenager named Gavrilo Princip shoots Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in the street. You picture it like a domino. Tip the first one, the rest stay standing. But historian Christopher Clark, who spent years studying the lead-up to the war, argued something uncomfortable in his book The Sleepwalkers. He described the great powers of Europe as walking, watchful but unseeing toward catastrophe. Not because one man pulled a trigger, but because the whole system was built to fall. So what was that system? Picture a set of tripwires strung across an entire continent. Germany was bound to Austria-Hungary, Russia was bound to Serbia, France was bound to Russia, Britain was loosely bound to France. Nobody planned for a small war. Every alliance was signed, assuming it would deter conflict, not guarantee one. That's the twist nobody tells you. The system built to prevent war was the exact mechanism that made it unstoppable once it started moving. Now add the timetables. This is the part your history class probably skipped. Military mobilization in 1914 wasn't a switch you could flip on and off. Once Russia began mobilizing its army, the trains were already scheduled. Troops, horses, artillery, all moving on rigid timelines that took weeks to plan and could not be reversed without collapsing the entire system. Historian Barbara Tuchman, in The Guns of August, described generals who understood this in chilling terms. Stopping mobilization halfway wasn't caution, it was chaos. It meant half your army stuck at the wrong station with no supply lines. So once the trains started moving, politicians lost control. The machine had already made the decision for them. Now go back to your mission. You saved Franz Ferdinand. Congratulations. The alliances are still signed, the timetables are still loaded, the nationalism is still boiling in a dozen capital cities. Somewhere else, a border skirmish, a naval incident, a diplomatic insult misread by one tired ambassador. That's your new spark. History had plenty of matches. It only needed one. Here's where it gets personal, because you do this too. When something goes wrong in your life, you look for the one moment, the one decision. If only I hadn't sent that message. If only I'd left 5 minutes earlier. You build a neat single-cause story because a single cause feels fixable. But most outcomes, in a life or in a continent, aren't the result of one choice. They're the result of pressure that had been building for a long time, through channels you didn't build and mostly couldn't see. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman called part of this hindsight bias. Once you know how something ended, your brain quietly edits the story so the ending looks obvious, even inevitable, even though it wasn't obvious at all beforehand. That's why war feels like fate looking backward and feels like chance looking forward. You're not remembering 1914 accurately. You're remembering the version your brain simplified for you. This is also why one small change fantasies are so seductive. They flatter you. They suggest that history or your own life is fragile enough that one clever intervention from you could have redirected everything. It's a comforting idea. It's also usually wrong. Complex systems, whether they're made of alliances and railway timetables or of habits and relationships, rarely hinge on a single thread. They're held up by dozens of threads at once. Cut one, and the others usually catch the weight. So let's finish the thought experiment properly. Say you don't just save the Archduke. Say you go further. You quietly convince the Serbian nationalists to stand down. You slip into a few war offices and delay a mobilization order by forging a signature. You're doing more than any time traveler in any movie has ever attempted. And still, the deeper you go, the more you find the same pattern repeating. Behind every flashpoint is another one. Behind every treaty is a decade of resentment that produced it. You start pulling threads meant to save 1914, and you find yourself back in 1870, back in the unification of Germany, back in colonial competition across Africa, back in economic rivalries that had been sharpening for 2 generations. At some point, you have to ask yourself an uncomfortable question. Are you trying to prevent a war, or are you trying to prevent an entire century? That question is the real reframe hiding inside your mission. You came here looking for a single villain and a single fix. What you found instead was a structure. Structures don't care who pulls the trigger. If a structure is loaded, it will find a hand. This isn't just true of world wars. It's true of arguments that seem to explode over something small, when really the tension had been loading for months. It's true of companies that collapse because of one bad quarter, when the real damage was done years earlier by decisions nobody wanted to revisit. It's true, honestly, of most of the moments in your own life that felt sudden. They weren't sudden. You just weren't watching the slow part. There's a strange kind of relief in this if you let yourself feel it. If the war wasn't caused by one man's decision, then it also wasn't your job to catch that one bullet. You were never the missing piece standing between peace and catastrophe. Nobody is, most of the time. The forces that shape history, and the forces that shape a single life, are usually too distributed for any one hero or any one time traveler to fully redirect. So maybe the correction isn't preventing the moment. Maybe it's noticing the pattern earlier. Watching for the alliances quietly forming around you, the timetables you didn't realize were already running. The resentment sitting under the surface of something that looks calm. That's not as satisfying as catching a bullet. It's slower, it's less cinematic. But it's the only version of prevention that ever actually works, in history or in your own life. You step back into the machine. Somewhere behind you, a young man is still loading a pistol. You already know the real answer is far stranger than stopping him ever could have been.